How do you read this escalation?
Well, here's the thing. On the surface, it seems like one of the most dramatic and confusing reversals in U.S. foreign policy positioning in recent memories. After all, for years, Trump has been skeptical towards U.S. involvement in the war and repeated suggestions that he could end the war in 24 hours through negotiations. Now he's appearing to pivot towards a more militarized approach, authorizing a significant new arms package for Ukraine, reportedly telling President Zelensky to strike military targets inside Russia as long as he avoids Moscow. But all of that is in itself appears to be contradictory. Why, Moscow has legitimate military targets, including the political elites, which are ultimately responsible for the decision making inside the regarding this war. Moreover, he appears to have quietly walk back their earlier threats of enforcing secondary sanctions and tariffs on countries doing business with Russia.
It is in
So,
Trump's validity to put 100% sanction on Russia?
so there are two different things. One is to tariff Russia itself. The second issue is the issue of secondary sanctions on countries that are doing business with Russia. He is still threatening the tariff issue, but it would not take effect until after 50 days from his announcement. The secondary sanctions issue seems to have disappeared off the headlines after his initial comments. And the fact that he is walking back some of the financial repercussions for Russia so quickly raises serious questions about his endgame, his strategic calculus, and the signals he's sending to both Kiev and Moscow. So the biggest decision is to authorize new weapons deliveries to Ukraine. It's a major strategic pivot, but on the other hand, most of these weapons are defensive. Most of them have already been authorized, and many of them were en route to Ukraine to begin with, but they were paused by one of the Trump's appointees, Eldridge Colby, who essentially claimed that providing Ukraine with patriots would deplete U.S. strategic reserves in that regard. And
Got your
uh,
point. Got your point. Trump's decision to supply Ukraine with Patriot and Tomahawk systems marks a radical departure from his earlier reluctance. What changed in this calculus?
the optics changed. Some credit Melania with this decision because Trump, after yet another positive discussion with Putin, came back to hear Melania underscore that right after that conversation, Putin authorized an attack on another civilian hub, another city in Ukraine, and this has been a repeated pattern. Putin seemed to take these calls with Trump as a green light to continue aggression, particularly once defensive aid to Ukraine was paused. And in recent weeks, these attacks have escalated, accumulating civilian casualties, and it's created very negative publicity for Trump. For Trump himself, he also became aware of the fact that he is not making diplomatic gains in this war. It's no closer to its resolution than when he first took office, despite his promises to end it very quickly. None of that bodes well for Trump's posture as a peacemaker. Another pressure point is external to the conflict, which is his inability to end through diplomatic means other foreign policy crises, including the war in Gaza, and to get Iran to come back to the negotiating table and to conclude a new nuclear
That's a
deal with
lot.
Iran.
That's a lot on his plate. Trump clarified he opposes Ukraine using U.S. missiles to strike Moscow. Yet he's expanding arms support. Is he walking a fine line between escalation or also trying to leave the door open for talks with Russia?
Yes, he is on the one hand is engaging in tactical assistance to Ukraine, which is a major psychological and strategic shift even for him. But the distinction of drawing a red line around what he perceives as symbolic escalation, even though it's been done many times before, is that he wants to increase pressure on Putin without triggering what he believes to be a full-scale Russian retaliation or nuclear panic. He's trying to choreograph the war in a way that he believes would maximize battlefield leverage while preserving plausible space for future negotiations. However, there's no evidence that anything would change because, as I said, we've been there before. Nothing seems to have stopped Putin from continuing attacks on civilians. Rather, that's a testimony to Russia's military weakness and its ability to make major groundbreaking progress on the battlefield. Ukraine's successful operations against not just Moscow but other military targets, such as Operation Spiderweb, have significantly weakened Russia's military capacity. If anything, continuing to attack Russia's launch sites and production facilities inside Russia and major political and economic targets in Moscow would send a much stronger signal and psychological signal to the political elites in Russia and perhaps cause them to reconsider where Russia stands in terms of their military capacity in this conflict.
Oh,
But
okay.
also,
Russia
mhm.
has dismissed the ultimatum as a theatrical gesture, but internally, elites are reportedly growing anxious. Could this mark the beginning of a rupture within Russia's power structure?
I don't think so. I think it's very unlikely, and even if it is, Putin has been ruthless with anyone who opposes him. So long as an authoritarian dictator is in power, there's no chance for alternative viewpoints to put significant pressure sufficiently to put an end to the war. However, it would still be useful in terms of weakening Russia from within and making it less cohesive and less coordinated. Uh, Putin views these 50 days as an advantage that he was given, a time to maximize airstrikes on Ukraine and to try to gain ground advantage and to make maximum trade deals and everything else he needs to ensure his ability to continue the war effort. He sees
What do you
these
think that Putin will make out of the 50 days?
He sees it as a timeline to continue striking, a free time, and this is what he's been bargaining for. So Russia needs time. It needs time because it has experienced heavy personnel losses, heavy equipment losses, heavy financial and economic losses. Being given 50 additional days with no financial or economic repercussions is a boon for Russia. It's an advantage that they can use to accumulate as much as they can in terms of deals with other countries, whether they're North Korea, whether they're raiding rare earth minerals and metals, precious metals in Africa, or laundering money through assorted third countries. All of that is a time that Putin is gaining from his perspective.
Got your point.
Um,
Polling shows 64% of Russians now support peace talks. Do you believe this growing sentiment could pressure the Kremlin, or is public opinion too weak to penetrate the hardline war consensus?
Public opinion is irrelevant in terms of actually affecting decision making regarding the war, but it is relevant in the case that dissatisfied public creates additional and distracting problems internally, and anything that weakens Russia and forces it to consider internal issues is a distraction from its ability to do damage externally and to plan for other potential invasion operations. From that perspective, the shift in public opinion is useful. It also delegitimizes the war internationally because many countries have been looking towards internal Russian support as a justification for their own support for Moscow. Seeing that the public opinion is squarely towards diplomacy could make that important shift in the level of assistance Russia is getting from others.
Some argue that Trump's shift is a performance for the West and that no real pressure is being applied to Russia. Do you believe Trump still sees a deal with Moscow as possible?
I think he still very much is geared towards that, and the evidence for that is his own recent quote. He was asked whose side he is on in his conflict, and he said that he's on nobody's side and that he doesn't support either country. And frankly, I think he believed that Ukraine would be easier to pressure because it's a smaller and weaker country, and because he seemed to have a personal admiration and a sense of rapport with Putin. That turned out to not be the case. So now he's shifting towards this sort of neutrality for the sake of making a deal. I do not believe he actually necessarily wants Ukraine to win. That is not his position. His position is to achieve some sort of a diplomatic breakthrough by a stalemate between two sides when they both
Okay,
decided
Trump's
not to fight.
earlier envoys had floated proposals recognizing Russia's territorial gains in return for freezing the front lines. Why did those efforts collapse, and do they still represent a potential framework for future talks?
Well, Ukraine was never going to go along with the territorial concessions to Russia, and quite frankly, nobody except maybe Trump and some of his advisors, seriously believed that Russia, even upon a symbolic acceptance of those terms, would ever really fully stop in its goal. It would, at best, postpone its continued aggression, whether in Ukraine or outside Ukraine. But Russia has been engaged in other acts of aggression outside Ukraine already. So additional concessions would not put an end to internal ambitions. Once those ambitions are set in an authoritarian state, even military failures and diplomatic agreements don't necessarily mean much. And Russia has violated every single major agreement it has concluded internationally with the U.S. in the past decades. So there's no reason to believe it would ever honor something like that, even if it had agreed for the sake of a brief pause or getting something out of the international community.